All right. My name is Dr. Orlando Rivera, and this is a presentation on 200-meter pacing strategy, which is heavily supported by research from Yoshimoto et al. This past year. So let's kind of just get right into this. This is definitely an interesting topic of mine. I've thought about this a lot over the years. Came to one conclusion. I kind of switched thoughts. I came to another conclusion. But I think based on this most recent study and based on my last year or two of coaching, I might have kind of went back in another direction. So let's talk about this. So when we are kind of coaching athletes, right? We've got essentially, we'll call it five main events up to the 400, right? We've got the 55 or 60-meter dash. Should that be an all-out effort? So when we say pacing, we're saying should we hold back at all, right? So I'm just going to use an all-out effort, 100% effort, right? And in the 55 or 60, I think it is without question, right? Elite athletes will accelerate, as you'll see later on, up to at least 60 meters, right? So the 100, should that be an all-out effort? I'm going to say yes. The 100 should be an all-out effort from the gun. I wrote I think because that'll be a discussion for later on. Now let's look at the other end of the spectrum, where the 55 and the 100 are clearly yeses. The 400 is a clear no, right? I think if you've ever been to a track and field meet, you would recognize that no, you cannot go all out. Is the 300 an all-out effort? The answer is a clear no. If you've ever watched the kickoff meet and watched freshman sophomore at the kickoff meet, or if you've ever been to the freshman sophomore meet that I always go to in December, it's one of my favorite meets because it's hysterical watching freshman sophomore run their first ever 300. They think it's an all-out effort, and then they'll pay the price later on. So the 400 and 300 is clear no's, right? What about the 200? Well, this is where I, early on in my career, said yes, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. At some point in my career, I started to say, maybe not. We played around with some things. Those things didn't seem to work in terms of pacing efforts. And I kind of switched back to, all right, just go all out. Well, maybe I'm wrong on that. So let's take a look. So first, let's look at where do we slow down, right? So a lot of people kind of don't recognize that even the most elite athletes are going to slow down during a 100-meter sprint. So this is a look at the 100-meter final where Usain Bolt ran 9:58 and ran the current world record. What you can see here, these are their 10-meter splits, and if you follow my mouse, you can see that Usain Bolt accelerated up to the 70-meter mark and ran his fastest 10-meter split between the 60 and the 70. And then along with him, the other fastest sprinters in the world, right? Tyson Gay and Asafa Powell, they ran their fastest splits up to the 60-meter mark, right? After that, you can see that even the fastest ever to do it are slowing down, right? The last 30 to 40 meters of even a 100-meter sprint race. So this is probably some evidence to say, maybe we shouldn't go all out in the 1, but that's a different conversation. What about the 2? Okay. So let's talk about my approach first, right? Like I said, my current approach has been just go all out, right? I'm working with predominantly high school athletes. Yes, I know very well, and I've known for some time that I know we slow down in the 100. I know that we slow down in the 200 quite a bit over the final 100 meters. Having said that, like I said earlier, I have tried pacing strategies with athletes before in the 200, where I've given them advice, hey, let's accelerate. I guess the strategy that I typically say in the 200 is, hey, let's accelerate all out up to about 40 meters, maybe even 50 meters. From there, let's enter a quote-unquote float phase, and then let's come off the turn hard, right? I've tried this with 2 athletes, of which weren't overly successful, and I probably didn't push hard enough, right? My quote here is Javon Lawrence, the best sprinter that's ever come out of North Rockland High School and probably out of Section 1, right? Well, it didn't really work for him. And I quote from Javon after a poor 200-meter effort. That shit don't work. So, after trying it a few times with Javon, and I think we practiced it probably twice in practice, I basically gave it up. Right. And again, this is coming from a guy who just coached the New York State record holders in the 4x2. So it's not like I've got a bunch of bums in the 200 meters. We are quite literally the fastest collection of 200-meter sprinters New York State has ever seen. So with that group, they ran all out. Right. So now what does research say? So, kind of my epiphany moment actually is looking a little bit more at Darwin, right? So, some runners kind of naturally figure out pacing strategies on their own. So, again, with all high schoolers up to this point, I pretty much say, hey, just go all out from the gun during the 200. Darwin is a perfect example of someone who's kind of naturally figured out the 200. He ran 22 flat indoors multiple times. He ran 21 something outdoors. I forget off the top of my head. But you can pretty much see Darwin when he's racing that he is naturally, right, a 200-meter runner. He appears to be accelerating off of the turn. And you'll see the best in the world are actually doing that, right? So let's look at the research from Yoshimoto et al. So this was a pretty cool design. The first thing they did was they reviewed 53 world-class sprinter results. What they looked at is they looked at 10-meter splits, and then they also looked at 100-meter and 200-meter times, right? 100 and 200-meter splits, I should say, of their fastest 200-meter efforts. One of the cool things that they found was the second 200 was always faster than the first 100. Well, at first glance, this is like, oh my God, that's amazing. So maybe we should change our pacing strategy. Well, then you got to think, nope, this is pretty obvious because in the first 100, they have to accelerate. So their first 30 to 40 meters is obviously going to be slower because they're accelerating. They have reaction time to the gun. So it's obvious with that. And then beyond that, they also have to run the turn, and turn running might be a little bit slower, right? The cooler thing about this study, and I think it's probably the most impactful thing, was looking at 100-meter splits as a percentage of 100-meter personal best. So this is, once again, looking at 100-meter splits during their fastest 200 and compared that split to their fastest 100 ever. So this is essentially that, right? So what you can see here is both the black and the white. So the black essentially are the faster runners, right? These are the runners that were running sub 20 seconds in the 200. The white were runners that were just over 20 seconds, right, in the graph. And the cool thing about this is you can see that every single runner ran approximately 96% of their fastest 100 meters during the first 100 meters of a 200, right? So if you kind of think about it, well, that's kind of interesting. Now, I think some people might argue and say, well, is the turn the reason they're running nearly 4% slower? And I would say maybe. I think that's possible, but I doubt that the turn is contributing to 4% difference solely from the turn, right? There's more evidence to kind of support my current opinion. Now, the other thing about the study was not only did they look at 53 of these athletes, they actually did an intervention with one, so it was a case study intervention with one world-class athlete. During that intervention, the athlete trained twice a week using a pacing strategy. They did different distances from 120 to 250 meters. The athlete was instructed to run approximately 10.6 during the first 100 meters of all of those efforts and then finish maximally. So he can get used to running at something around 10.6 pace. The cool thing about this intervention study was after doing this intervention and going through this training intervention, this athlete lowered his personal best from 20.43 to 20.14. Now, some people might say, hey, maybe the athlete just got better. I think the other cool thing about this was during the racing season where he lowered his personal best by nearly 0.3 of a second, it was the actual, during the PB attempt, he had his slowest first 100 of the entire season. So he had run the 200 several times, and during his 20.1 effort, it was actually his slowest first 100, right? Now, there's some other research that actually also supports this, and I just kind of want to highlight one person here, right? Going back to that one study looking at Usain Bolt, right, and his splits during the 100, they also looked at his 200. And I think the cool thing here is you can see Usain Bolt ran 9.92 during his first 100 of his world record 19.19. I did the math, and you could see that ends up being also about 96.5% of his 100 meter personal best. So once again, that number of 96% kind of keeps creeping back up. Now, again, some people might say, "Oh, the turn is what's contributing to the athletes running 4% slower," and I think that could be an argument. But then, if you look at this graphic, this is what I think kind of completely shuts down that argument. This is a look at Noah Lyles and Leslie Tobago, two of the current best 200-meter runners in the world. This is showing their running velocities per 10-meter split. You can see that running velocity is highest around 70 meters, which agrees with all evidence. The coolest thing about this is you can see that there is a clear re-acceleration at approximately the 110 meter mark. So this is once again now showing that athletes are kind of choosing this pacing strategy and then re-accelerating off of the turn, right? And the nice thing about these athletes, they actually maintained their pace from the 130 through the 150. So, should you run the 200 meter all out? And honestly, I think both of these studies are going to change my current policy on this. And I think the answer is no, you should not run it all out, right? I work with high school athletes, right? I understand that is very different than working with high-level collegiates or professional athletes, right? I would say probably with freshman, sophomore, maybe I wouldn't say anything to them about not running it all out. But once you get to an athlete who takes instruction well and understands pacing strategies well, this isn't something that happens kind of like overnight or happens with one or two practices. I think this takes a lot of practices with an athlete who understands different paces, who understands the difference from 96% effort to 98% effort to 100% effort. So 96% appears to be kind of the general target pace for that first 100 during a 200 meter effort. My question is it really 96% effort? It might not be, once again, because of the turn, right? But it probably is something like 97% effort, right? Something along those lines, right? In addition to that, as I said, I think this needs to be practiced. In the case of an outdoor season, this probably needs to practice mid-season, where we've got some speed work under our belt. So in the case of most of my athletes, we're talking about late April through May. And then, honestly, I think once you start to get more towards the later parts of the season, I think you're probably doing a lot more like overspeed type work, right? Beyond that, one thing I plan on doing, just haven't had time yet, is putting together a chart looking at what 96% looks for 100-meter runners, right? So, for example, we know that Bolt, who's run 9.58, right, should be running somewhere around 9.92 for his first 100. Well, what does that look like for other runners? Runners that run 11 seconds, 11.5 seconds, so on and so forth. I'll put a chart together, and I don't know. I'm pretty hopeful that this will have some real meaningful effects on some of my athletes' 200-meter times.